So there's a question that comes up, and I think it's a question worth asking. And the question is about money. And the question is, can money buy happiness? Can money buy happiness? I think the obvious answer, we'd say, well, of course not. We know that money doesn't buy happiness. You've never seen, people will say things like, you've never seen a U-Haul behind a hearse. Like, we know that at some point, money just cannot make us happy. Money can't buy us happiness. And yet, maybe it can. A couple of people who have done some research on this. One is a man named Arthur Brooks. Arthur Brooks is, he studies happiness and talks about happiness for a living. And one of the things he points out is that one of the things that poverty does, poverty increases suffering. Financial insecurity increases anxiety. And when we have less stuff, we have less happiness. And so he makes a point. He says, while money can't buy happiness, it can remove unhappiness. If you have some money, you had financial worries. Now you have money, you don't have financial worries. You're stressed about how you're going to pay your bill. You have money, you're not stressed anymore about how to pay your bill. So it might not be able to buy happiness, but at least it can remove unhappiness. There's another man, his name is Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman did this pretty famous research where a survey across the United States, where he was looking at the income. What's the income threshold? Like what is the optimal, say, yearly income for people to feel like emotionally stable, like kind of contented when it comes to the stuff they have? And he found out that emotional well-being increased until a person made roughly $75,000 a year. Now, this was in 2010 money, but it was roughly $75,000 a year. And they felt better and better and better. And then after $75,000 per year, beyond that, the gains, whatever kind of emotional satisfaction, happiness gains, were much smaller. So at some point, it increased. Just like Arthur Brooks would say, unhappiness decreased and some kind of emotional well-being increased, but then there was a cap. So you have these two men, but there's a third man. His name is Michael Norton. Michael Norton made a claim. His claim was this. His claim was that money actually can buy you happiness. It just depends what you spend it on. If there's a word that's kind of summarizes today's gospel, that word is give. Right? The word of the day would be give. The first line of the gospel today is how Jesus had heard about the death of St. John the Baptist, that John the Baptist had given his life, right, in testimony to the truth. Jesus, heartbroken, he goes off, but he sees the crowds, and what's he do? He stops and he gives his time, he gives his attention, he gives healing to the crowds. When the crowds are hungry, what happens? Jesus says, well, to the disciples, give them some food. They have 5 loaves and 2 fish. They give the 5 loaves and 2 fish to Jesus, who gives them to the crowd. See, if there is one key for the gospel today, it is give. It's that they gave. So Michael Norton asked the question, does money buy happiness? He'd say it depends on what you spend it on. And he identified 3 things. He said, you're not going to get happy if you buy stuff, but if you spend money on experiences, people experience a certain degree of happiness. I know families who do this. I know families who have decided as a family, like, we don't do Christmas or birthday presents. What we do is we do one big family trip, or a moderate sized family trip, where it's not just, we're not giving you stuff, we're going to make memories together. So experiences. Another thing is when people spend their money on events that bring others together rather than on solitary endeavors, that brings them happiness. But the third thing, and the thing that maybe made people the happiest, again, does money buy happiness? It depends what you spend it on. When people would spend their money on helping others who are in need, they actually would genuinely increase happiness. And another way to say it is, when people found themselves in a place where they could give, if they gave, they grew happy. And I think this is fascinating because it makes so much sense. It makes so much sense for us because, again, other researchers have pointed out the fact that there's a requirement to think of others if we want to escape this self-trap. Jonathan Haidt talks about this. Jonathan Haidt, he claimed this. He claimed that depression can often strongly be related to excessive self-focused attention. That depression can be, maybe neurologically, looks very different, looks very similar, looks nothing different than thinking about ourselves. Another way to say it, rumination, is the technical word that they've used. And say ruminating, what's ruminating? Not just thinking about yourself in the sense of paying attention to yourself, but rumination is this. Rumination means repeatedly turning your attention inward and asking questions like, well, why am I like this? Why did this happen to me? This kind of guilty or self-accusation, or this kind of sense of resentment, turning in on oneself. A woman named Susan Nolan Hexma, she warned that ruminating like this, without any movement forward, without any taking action, without acceptance, without any problem solving, leads people to places of depression. Again, remember, keep in mind, this is not self-awareness, this is self-preoccupation. We know we need to be self-aware. We know we need to tend to ourselves. Even Jesus in the gospel, self-aware, tending to himself. He hears about the death of his cousin, that we imagine not only was his forerunner, but was also at some point maybe a friend. He hears about the death of his cousin, and he goes away. Why? Because he's attending to the grief in his heart. He's attending to his own heart. So yes, here's Jesus in the Gospels who goes away. He's paying attention to himself. But then what does he do? He notices others. And he moves. And this is what we have to do too, right? What we need to do, we need to visit those places in our lives. We need to visit those places in our hearts that need attending. And we need to treat ourselves like we're someone worth caring about. Once we do that, the next move is give. The next invitation for all of us is to give. So the question today I would ask is so how do we do that? If we know that the word of the gospel today is give, how do we give? Well, there's at least three ways. I think three ways that we will find ourselves giving like God. And the first one is I give all that I can give right now. Now, I make this claim. Not necessarily I give all that I have. But the invitation, I think, is to ask the question, what is all that I have to give here in the gospel? We know that, not in this gospel we heard today, but in a different gospel, we hear that there was one young person who came forward, a young boy who came forward and said, I have 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he gave, what did he do? He gave all that he had to give at that moment. And this is one of the things for us, again, not give everything, but when I give all that I have to give right now, there's something so powerful about this, that God can do so much with this. Another gospel, in the Gospel of John chapter 2, we know the story of the wedding feast at Cana. What happens to Jesus and his disciples, his mom, they're invited to this wedding. The wine runs out. Mary, his mom, goes to Jesus and says, they've run out of wine. So what does this have to do with me? And she tells the attendants, do whatever he tells you. And what does Jesus tell them? He says, there were 6 stone water jars there for Jewish ceremonial washing, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. So up to 130 gallons total. And Jesus tells them, fill these with water. So they do it. And in fact, I think here's the interesting thing. It says they held up to 30 gallons each. What do they do? What would you do? I think I've thought about this and prayed with this a lot when it comes to that scene of here are these servants who are asked by Jesus to fill them. I've seen what these water jars look like. I've visited Cana in that space, and I've seen what these Jewish ceremonial water jars would look like, and it's just like it would take so many trips to fill 6 jars that could hold 30 gallons of water. I would have marginally filled them. I can see myself being like, well, okay, they're full enough. Half is full. But what does the gospel say? The gospel says, and they filled them to the brim. They could hold up to, 180 gallons is total. They held up to 180 gallons. And I just reflect on this. What is the limiting factor to God's work? The limiting factor to God's work is often, it's not God. The limiting factor to God's work is me. And the question I have to ask myself is, do I really want to give all that I have to give right now? If Jesus tells me to, I have to ask myself the question, do I really want to give all that I have to give right now? So will I? Well, again, what if they only partially filled them with water? Well, it still would have been a miracle, would have been incredible. But if they only partially filled them with water, you realize God had wanted to do so much more. I have a friend, I've mentioned him before, my friend named Nick. My friend Nick is a wife. He has some kids. He gives. If there's any word that defines Nick, is generous. He is a giver. I remember he and his wife, they weren't able to conceive children for the first 10 or more years of their marriage. At one point, they pursued the route of adoption, and there were 3 kids who were related by moms, but they had different dads. And they were able to adopt the first 2 boys, and there was a third, a daughter. And they were just praying, they were hoping that they could adopt the daughter and keep this family together. Turned out, at one moment, that the door opened. The door opened, and this daughter, this sister, could be their daughter. But if they were going to adopt her, it would literally drain their bank account to 0. They would have no money in the process of this whole adoption. And it was one of those situations where it was such an easy decision for Nick and his wife. We just give, because that's what defines them. After they have adopted these 3 kids, a couple of years later, they had 2 biological children of their own. So they have 5 kids, and they brought them all to Cambodia because to be missionaries, full-time missionaries in Cambodia. Because why? Because the defining word of their life is give. In fact, so much so that Nick, when he speaks, he's a great speaker, a great presenter, great preacher of the gospel. At one point, whenever he talks about generosity, whenever he talks about giving, he always says this line, and the line I've mentioned it before. He always says, "Give the big bill." And what that means is he gives these stories like, if you reach into your pocket, here's someone who's in need, or you're in church and they pass the collection plate around, and you reach in your pocket and you have a dollar, you have a 5, you have a 10, you have 100, whatever it is, 20. He says, "Give the big bill." Here's someone in need. I could give them a dollar. I could give them a 5, but I've got a 20. Give the big bill. And again, he can say that because he lives this. To be able to say, I give all that I have to give right now. Now, I have another friend who heard Nick give this talk. Her name is Delaney. And at one point, Delaney was so moved. She was young, early 20s at the time. And at one point, Delaney had heard this talk, and she was out with some friends. She met this new individual, and this guy was he was sharing how he didn't even have money for rent, didn't have money for groceries that month. And she was so moved, and she knew she had $100. And this is a ton of money for this 22-year-old person to have in her pocket. She's like, I have $100. Nick says, give the big bill. Here's a guy who can't pay his rent. He can't pay his grocery bill. And so she pulled him aside and said, listen, I've got $100 here. You said you're in need. I want you to have this. Amazing, incredible way that she was like, Nick does this. That's how Nick lives this life. He told me this. I'm living this life. I'm helping somebody. And she said, the man turned to her and said, oh my gosh, thank you so much. With this $100, I can now finish my tattoo. And she was like, wait, are you kidding me? She didn't ask for the money back. I would have asked for the money back. Like, no, you said you needed to pay your rent, you needed to pay your grocery bill. But this what involves is this invitation when we give is to give all that I have to give right now. Of course, it's a risk and it takes discernment. Well, let's look at our lives and say, okay, am I willing to give all that I have to give right now? Now, again, the discernment is this. Think about your time. I think about my time. And there's some times where someone wants time and I can't. Someone wants, can we have a phone call? Can we meet? I just legitimately can't because there's people I'm responsible for. But there's other times when I just won't. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. Where there's times legitimately that I do not have anything to give right now. I can't. And there's sometimes when we know in our hearts, it's not an I can't, it's just an I won't. So the first marker of how we give well is to give all that I have to give right now. The second way that we give well is we give well. Another way to say it is we give excellently. I think almost every summer I come back to this theme of giving excellently because I personally struggle with this. I've personally been convicted by this because what is it to give well? To give excellently is to give ungrudgingly. Is to give unhesitatingly. It's to give joyfully. That's what it is to give excellently. That's what St. Paul says in 2 Corinthians. He says, God loves a cheerful giver. If you've decided to give, just give joyfully. And I don't find myself doing this. I find myself struggling with this. Earlier this summer, I was summoned for jury duty. and it was the highlight of my summer. That is not the case. I was summoned for jury duty, and it was like one of those situations where, okay, on one random Wednesday morning, I was called in, and I was like, okay, and it was early. I got lost. I didn't know where parking was. I went into the wrong building. When I got to the right building, there were really bad directions, and there were lack of signage in the courthouse in Duluth here. I was inconvenienced, and I had other things. Of course, I had other things I needed to be doing, but I did it, right? Like I showed up, I was on time. I was actually early, which is kind of a big thing for me. I showed up, I was present, I did the thing I was asked to do. I did not do it excellently, as was pointed out to me by a friend who after the fact knew that I had at least 3 different text threads with 3 different groups of people complaining about everything that I was going through. Like, I'm lost in the parking lot. I'm in the wrong building. This sucks. I mean, it was just like every different person. I couldn't even just complain to one person. I had to complain to as many people as had to listen to my text, because I struggle with doing it excellently. To give excellently is to give ungrudgingly, unhesitatingly, and joyfully. So how do I give well? Give all I have to give right now, to give excellently. And lastly is to give out of love. When we're called to give, we're meant to give out of love, to give out of love for God and give out of love for neighbor. Thomas Aquinas, to kind of paraphrase Thomas Aquinas, he would say something along these lines. He might say something like, money can't buy happiness. Money can serve happiness, but money cannot be happiness. In fact, he would point out, we give not because it will make us happy. We give because we're made to give. This is what Aquinas would say. And then this is the last thing. Aquinas would point out, he would say, we give not because it'll make us happy, but because we're made for it. Because why? Because every one of us is made in God's image. And what is the deepest image of God? The deepest identity of God is that God is love, which is that God himself, his identity is he's a self-gift. The Father pours himself out in love to the Son pours himself out in love to the Father. That love, that gift, is the gift of the Holy Spirit. His deepest identity in the Trinity is God is a giver, because God is a lover. And even in the revelation of Jesus, what is one of the most famous passages in the Bible declare? John chapter 3, verse 16. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. See, that the identity of God is a giver, and that means your and my identity is that we have to be givers as well. So much so that God shows how far we're called to give. Jesus gave his life. And Jesus, even in grief, gave his life to death. So we're made to give. And we're most like God when we do that. When we give all we have to give right now. When we give excellently, unhesitatingly, ungrudgingly, joyfully. And when we give because we want to be like God to a world that is desperate for the gift.
You don't have to stay close. As long as you're somewhere out there, that's enough for me. I don't need to hold you near me, don't need promises to keep. Just the thought that you are breathing somewhere in this world I see. Even if I'm not beside you, even if you never know, there's a quiet kind of comfort just in knowing you still glow. I don't need forever. I just need you to exist. You don't have to stay with me. You don't have to feel the same. Just as long as you're still out there, calling softly through my days. You don't have to look my way. You don't have to be my home. It's enough to know you're living in a world I'm not alone. I won't chase you through the distance, won't disturb your chosen life. I'll just keep you in my silence, like a star that shines at night. Through the dark and through the blue, I still think of you. You don't have to stay with me. You don't have to feel the same. Just as long as you're still out there, calling softly through my days. You don't have to look my way. You don't have to be my home. It's enough to know you're living in a world I'm not alone. I don't need to be your light. I don't need to cross your mind. All I need is just the truth that you're somewhere still alive. You don't have to stay with me. You don't have to feel the same. Just as long as you're still out there, calling softly through my days. You don't have to look my way. You don't have to be my home. It's enough to know